I warmly welcome you, sir. Dr. John Martin is an expert in industrial relations, including workplace health and safety, workers' compensation, and anti discrimination law. He has extensive advocacy experience and has active representation of union movement in various forums, including before parliamentary committees. He is associated as a research and policy officer with Queensland Council of Unions. The Queensland Council of Unions is a Queensland peak union council with affiliated unions covering employees in the full range of industries and occupations. He has also worked as Employment Relations Manager, Human Resource Branch, Department of Community Service. His major roles include in leading negotiations and implementation of enterprise bargaining negotiations, implementation of Queensland government strategies, including flexible work practices, advocacy before industrial tribunals, streamlining procedure for consultative firms. He has also worked with Queensland University of Technology, Worley Parsons, and Blue Care. It's our privilege to have you here, Dr. John. I also welcome Professor Amit Jain, Pro Vice Chancellor, Amity University, Rajasthan. Now, to take this webinar ahead, I request Professor Amit Jain to please moderate the session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shikha. A very warm welcome to Professor John Martin. It's an honor to have you with us. I was going through your profile and I was really impressed the kind of work that you have done in terms of employee relations, industrial relations, advocacy, and several other domains. You have worked very closely with the government bodies also, as well as the university systems. So I'm sure the deliberations will benefit a lot, each and everyone who is attending. I also welcome all my faculty colleagues from Amity Business School and all MBA, BBA, and BCom students of Amity Business School who have joined in for this session. The topic that we are going to talk about is really interesting and very, very contextual as on date, because we are going to talk about employee relations and COVID-19. This COVID-19 has definitely led to unprecedented changes in the way we live, in the way we work, in the way we interact and communicate with the outside world. And I believe a lot of things have kind of become a new normal. But the worst fear that we all have faced as organizations and as employees is the fear of impact of COVID-19 on the businesses, on the employment, on the salaries or wages. And that has been a concern. As I understand, the India Inc., as we call it, the corporate world in India, dealt with it fairly well, and we have not seen a lot of massive layoffs for that matter. And the situation was managed very well with the support of the government, with a huge package announced in order to revive the economy. But definitely scars are there. It has affected, and we need to see that how we need to cope up with the changing world now. So the topic is very, very relevant. The discussion is going to be very, very apt for all, not only the business school students, but all the students of Amity University, Rajasthan. Uh, just for the benefit of our honored guests, I would like to give a brief about Amity University. So Amity as a group is one of India's largest education groups, and Amity has more than 175,000 brilliant students at any given point of time. So we have a pool of 6,000 faculty and scientists, 11 universities, 150 plus institutions, 15 overseas campuses, 25 schools and preschools, and more than 1,200 acres of campuses worldwide. So that makes us the number one and one of the largest education groups of the country. One of the constituents, which is Amity University, Rajasthan, which is hosting this particular program, is a lush green 152-acre campus in Jaipur, Rajasthan. We are very close to the north side and the capital of country, Delhi. And this campus is again a campus which represents the entire country. So we have students from all over the country. and we offer more than 100 programs at undergraduate, graduate, and PhD levels. Some of our prominent schools are Business School, School of Engineering and Technology, School of Information Technology. We do have architecture programs, and we do have programs in behavioral sciences and clinical psychology. So with a mix of program, a multidisciplinary university, we in a very short span of time relative to the universities that have been there, we have established our name. We ranked amongst the top universities in the state as per the ranking agencies of Government of India also. And we are a quality driven, research focused, innovative institution. We try to innovate in our pedagogy. We try to innovate in terms of our research. We have a very strong industry and society connect with several projects going on with the support of several funding agencies from government as well as the industry. So this was a brief about our university. Amity Business School is a flagship institution of Amity University, Rajasthan. We offer a master's program in business administration, MBA. We have a bachelor's of business administration. We have a BCom program, which is also affiliated and associated with ACCA qualification of UK. For all the programs, we have very good placements, and our students are proving and making their mark in the corporate world, not only in India, but globally. So this was a brief about the university. Without much ado, now I would like to invite Professor John Martin to make his presentations. And I'll request everyone who has any query to post their questions in the question box or the chat box. And I'll be happy to take up some of these questions at the end of Professor Martin's presentation. So over to you, Professor Martin. Thank you so much once again for being with us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome and yeah, that explanation of how impressive your university certainly is. Look, someone's promoted me to professor. I am not a professor. I'm a humble doctor. I've included my email address there, so I'd also invite if someone thinks of something after the event, feel free to send me an email with any comments or questions. So when asked, or when the request came to the business school, there was something that I had been working on, and I thought this might be an opportunity. Somewhat esoteric. The Australian industrial relations system that I'll attempt to explain in the time available is very peculiar to Australia, but some of our experiences may not be. So I'm hopeful that this can make some sort of contribution in a more general sense, having regard to the what we were talking about before the presentation about what is the new normal, which I think people, whether in academia or industry, are still trying to grapple with what is normal. Where are we? So first of all, can I say, the topic that I chose, I had no idea the tragic turn of events that was about to occur in India when I did choose this topic. And can I take the opportunity to say my condolences, to your nation for this, the tragedy. But I think what it demonstrates is there's obviously dangers with complacency around this particular virus, which we've seen in a number of countries, perhaps most notably the USA. And that's the numbers that I've put up here. This was from in early April. And I think you can see Australia's not a very heavily populated nation for the size of a continent. 25 million people's not a lot of people. Now, whether that's had something to do with the ability to avoid catastrophe, who knows? Also seems that temperature had something to do with it as well, because when COVID, when it first broke out, it was a Northern Hemisphere winter. And I think we were fortunate in Australia that it was our summer, because for whatever reason, the spread seems to be worse in winter. But in any case, looking at the numbers there, Queensland really did dodge a bullet by comparison to the rest of Australia. But then if you look at, we use the USA often for a comparison because it's an English-speaking liberal democracy. So, from that perspective, there's some similarities. But if you look at the deaths per 100,000, per thousand, then there's, I guess, a minuscule impact. Why that happened, I think there was, particularly from the Queensland government, there was very good management early on, and the virus was taken very seriously. Be that as it may, we didn't know that this was going to be the story. No one had any idea what was going to occur, and there was, I guess, probably reasonable to say a considerable amount of panic when COVID-19, when it first was apparent, well, this is a problem, and this is a problem that we've got. It's not, I think other similar viruses had not been pandemic, so there was nothing probably since the Spanish flu, which was over 100 years ago, that was anything like this. So there was nothing to go by, no textbook. So, imposing that upon an industrial relations system, and I think it's important to provide some sort of context there. So Australia has, and it still does to some extent, have an arbitration system, which for most of the 20th century made Australia one of only two countries that operated that way. It was Australia and New Zealand. So by arbitration, what we mean is that a tribunal had the power to regulate industrial relations for employers and employees in just about every industry, just about every occupation, and that was that was introduced early in the 20th century, and for the main had support of employers and employees through their unions. There was also bipartisan political support for most of the 20th century for this system, and that was, there's two major parties in Australia: the Liberal National Party, which is the centre right or conservative, and the Labor Party, which is the centre left. So that sort of consensus existed up until about the 1980s. And then we saw the adoption of a range of what we now describe as neoliberal economic policies. And I understand there's probably, whilst comparing Australia to India is fraught with danger, there are probably some similarities in the, say, post-war Australia to post-colonial India, that there was, support for industries, support for unions, and that, a protected economy. That started to, and strangely enough, it was a Labor government that started to introduce the economic reforms that we would now describe as neoliberal. That started, I guess, a ball rolling towards some employers and some from the right of politics to withdraw their support for the arbitration system. So eventually there was a shift from that system of arbitration and awards, they're called. That's the industrial instrument is called an award, what a tribunal makes, which sets is a comprehensive set of minimum conditions. So the consensus went away from that, and then it was a Labor government in accord with the union movement that actually introduced enterprise bargaining in the 1990s, which was probably a more measured change than you might have seen in Great Britain, for example, where it was large-scale deregulation of the labour market under the Thatcher government. Probably a more aggressive attitude adopted in the United States under the Reagan government. And in New Zealand, it was complete, not a deregulation. So, as I said before, New Zealand and Australia had a similar history with respect to the that arbitration system. In New Zealand, it was a big bang. The arbitration system was just removed in its entirety. Awards, that is, those minimum conditions of employment were removed and everything went to the market. Not so in Australia. And those system of awards still exist, although they've been relegated to a safety net. So I'm hoping that makes some sense in terms of the history. Now, what has that led to? Over time, it's now what's described as a wage growth crisis in Australia. And I think, as I explained to my students, I've always got to be careful of using Australian idiom. I'm not sure how some things translate, but the expression is, be careful what you wish for. And what's perhaps happened in Australia since this shift from arbitration to enterprise bargaining, over time, employers have been able to focus on their own wages and reduce their own wage costs. But that's had a deleterious effect at a national level. So aggregate demand, for example, is low because wage earners do not have the disposable income that they once had. So profits high. So from that perspective, but in terms of economic activity, you're seeing a what's been described as a low wage growth crisis. So that's not using the language of the trade union movement to explain it as a crisis. That's using the language of the governor of the Reserve Bank. So not someone you would consider to be radical in terms of politics or outlook, but it's been, that's one of the consequences. So most recently, seen a collapse of enterprise bargaining. That was what was meant to be how wages were driven. And you're seeing employers walking away from that system of enterprise bargaining and probably returning to the award system that was only ever meant to be a safety net. There's the authors that I've cited there describe an ongoing shift in power from labor to capital, which, as I said earlier, be careful what you wish for. It's perhaps the individual enterprise thinks that's a good thing, but at an aggregate level, it has problems. And then, of course, the public sector, for probably political reasons as much as anything else, the wage increases in the public sector have declined because it's not good politics to be awarding government employees higher wage increases than those that are being received in the private sector. Would be good economics to do that, but not good politics in terms of creating some sort of jealousy, the politics of envy that would be associated with that. So for those reasons, what we've seen in recent times is what they call a decoupling of wages and productivity growth. So probably for most of the 20th century, you would have seen real wages increase at the same rate as productivity, as labour productivity. So what that means is that labour is sharing in the growth in wealth, the growth in national income. Since all of those factors that have led to the low wage growth, we're also seeing productivity improving and wages starting to flatline. So that has problems for income inequality and an ongoing wealth inequality, which is, I guess, something that Australia had traditionally prided itself on, that we would have seen ourselves, whilst we're a liberal democracy, we would see ourselves as a very egalitarian one, particularly by comparison to the United States. That's probably no longer the case, and that's leading to a number of social difficulties or social problems. So the other problem that is facing the Australian workforce, and in turn having a deleterious effect on the Australian economy, is precarious employment. So it's not, this is nothing new about precarious employment, and I'll go through some of the types there I've written them all down there so I don't forget any, but it's been there for several decades now, and it's interconnected with the low wage growth. Certainly, when workers are not confident in their employment status, that's going to have two major impacts. One, it's going to impact on the way in which they conduct themselves as a consumer. And secondly, it's going to impact negatively on their capacity to seek wage increases. So it's a chicken and egg, I guess, or a downward spiral might be the other way to look at it, that the precarious employment follows the low wage growth, and the low wage growth follows the precarious employment. They're both interconnected. So when we talk about casual employment, we're talking about, well, a true casual each engagement stands alone. I'm not sure how well these types of employment translate into an Indian context, but we would have had traditionally, most people would have expected to have ongoing employment that would be associated with various forms of leave, like annual leave, sick leave. They might be paid a weekly wage plus overtime, or they might be paid a salary if they're in executive positions. So casual employment, as I said, instead of those various forms of leave and any sort of tenure associated with it, as I said, each engagement stands alone. So casually, the difficulty with casual employment is you don't know whether you're working tomorrow. Obviously very difficult to plan a life around that. So we'll talk about marginal self-employment. We're talking about probably the difference between an employee and an independent contractor, where there's many workers, to use that neutral term, who have now turned to self-employment because employment doesn't exist. And from one perspective, you can say, oh, that's good, they're entrepreneurial, and that means you've got business happening. However, that's probably not the case. Like, these people are not price setters. They're receiving a price. And for all intents and purposes, they may as well be employees. It's just the nature of their engagement is as an independent contractor. Temporary migrant, but strangely enough, that the COVID's probably, whether it's fixed a problem or created another problem, the temporary migrant workers that was probably a fairly serious problem with exploitation that we found with the migrant workers, mainly because, well, there's a range of precariety associated with them. Firstly, their employment's precarious, but then if their visa status is precarious on top of that, that leads to fairly significant exploitation. One problem that I've noted or seen is with student visas, where an employer has deliberately sought to have a student work beyond their visa, what their visa allows them to, which makes them incredibly vulnerable when that occurs. Temporary employment means for a short period of time. Labour hire has, that's been, I guess, there was the traditional use for labour hire, which is probably, when you need either expertise or extra staff for a specific period of time. But we've seen labour hire grow to the extent where entire workforces are outsourced. And then, of course, more recently, we've seen part-time employees, that is, people who are meant to be the equivalent of full-time employees but working less hours, who are really treated as casuals. So much so that this has brought the workforce down to be about 1/3 of our workforces in what you would consider traditional employment. Now, this is not an Australian problem. Now, Tom Kokens, an American academic, he and some other academics came up with what was described as the strategic choice theory, which was in the 1980s trying to explain some of the things I've just explained, or I haven't explained them, I've illustrated them. But in any case, Tom Kokens probably hit on a number of things that have occurred, particularly in the United States, but also in Australia, concerningly, where you see the rise of right-wing extremist organisations. That's a particularly concerning trend. If one considers the similarities between the 2020s and the 1920s, which where we ended up in the 1930s with the rise of fascism, then this is a concerning trend, and the theory is that if we go back to that consideration of where the working class is not being brought along with the level of prosperity, which can be evidenced by that gap between real wages and productivity, they will start looking for alternative solutions. And unfortunately, that may include some of the ideologies on the extreme right. Thankfully, not as bad in Australia as it is in the United States, but I would be ignoring the reality if I didn't say that there was some backlash against immigrants in Australia. Again, this is closely linked to that first point. When you're looking for someone to blame, it's an easy explanation, isn't it? There's immigrants who are taking our jobs. That's nonsense. That they're not taking your jobs; they're doing the jobs that you wouldn't be prepared to do. I do recall seeing something about the farm workers in California, all of whom are Hispanic. They put on their website, okay, any Americans who want to come along and do our job, you're entitled to do it. Come along, see how long you last. Also, I've seen something similar with on Facebook with Indian taxi drivers in Australia saying, yeah, come and do my job. I'd like to see you do it. And I guess a good thing that we're seeing is in the other direction, protests for Indigenous people, which is starting to happen in Australia. protests against the pandemic lockdowns, and some very peculiar conspiracy theories arising out of that, and protests against authoritarian government. So these are the 5 mega trends that Tom Koken had. His question, is this an American problem? And the answer is unfortunately no. That's a difficulty that we're seeing, particularly, well, to a lesser extent in Australia, but I would think there are worrying signs in Britain and Europe as well in that regard. Okay, I thought I just might contextualise that those they're the various industry groups that the Australian Bureau of Statistics keeps statistics for, and as you can see, there's been a growth in, as you would expect, decline in manufacturing, and increases in the service sector, in particular education and healthcare are the areas where there has been a growth in employment, and that's comparing what happened up until from November 13 till February 2020. Then if we look at what happened after, so this is the quarter that the COVID-19 impacted. And I don't know why electricity, gas, water and waste had an increase in employment. Like, I don't think anyone's figured out why that would have been the case. But as you can see, finance was probably one of the only industries that had an increase in employment, and some industries, in particular, the accommodation food services, so the hospitality sector, got smashed, big time, because you could not go to a restaurant, you could not go to a hotel. Transport, postal and warehousing, that would be mainly airlines. So the airlines just ceased to operate. And the worst one, as we see comedy and tragedy, there was the arts. That was the industry that was probably hit the worst. Just again comparing what's increased, healthcare has increased, which with an aging population is probably not surprising. Manufacturing has decreased. Okay, so what were some of the responses? And this was advocated for by the Australian trade union movement, and agreed to eventually by the Australian government, and that was the JobKeeper payment. So an amount of $1,500 per fortnight, which is around about $1,100 US per fortnight, was paid to people to do it. That was part of a package to stop us going into a depression. So a recession had hit. Without this, I think you would have seen a replication of 1929. You would have seen the downward spiral of depression. So this was was welcomed by just about everyone. It's now ceased, but it cost billions to do, but it was a necessity. So, and I got to, in terms of the current federal government, probably surprising that they would be so willing to apply what would be described as a welfare policy. They're not renowned for that. So was a good move. There's also a review into industrial relations laws in Australia, and that had been announced before COVID. Now, what happened was that the Morrison government, the federal government, had announced this thing and did not bother to talk to the trade union movement about it. When COVID hit, the ACTU were suddenly invited to be part of that discussion. And if you recall what I said earlier, we had no idea how difficult it was going to be, and that we probably did dodge a bullet. So the ACTU believe the reason that they were invited into these discussions is what we now describe as essential workers. Those were the ones that were, whether they're nurses, paramedics, doctors, even retail workers were probably in the unionised sector of the economy. And the belief was that's why it was important to keep the unions in the tent in that early days of the COVID-19. So I think looking at that level of cooperation that was early, there was this short-lived optimism, and this was what I was working on at the time, and I was looking at it from a negotiation perspective, because we started to see probably a level of cooperation that we hadn't seen in Australian industrial relations for, I'd say, 3 decades. And this is, and probably only for people as old as myself could remember what this was like, unions and employers actually sitting down cooperatively, and unions and governments being cooperative. It was quite different, and probably how things were done once upon a time. That didn't last, and I guess the suspicion is that everyone reverted to form. Whether that's the unions or employers and their organisations, or the federal government, that they, once it was realised that that things weren't as bad as they seemed to be, that level of cooperation disappeared. So that resulted in a bill going to Parliament, and it was basically defeated in the upper house. So that's, I think I've done that just about on time. So any questions?
Yes.
I think we've got one there. We've got 2.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions, and definitely we'll take it up. But thank you so much. It was really interesting to know about the Australian system, and I believe the initiatives and moves that were taken by the government were, good for that time, because the timely decisions in terms of JobKeeper package probably helped to prevent the migration of the workforce to different places. What we found here in India, that was a major problem, because majority of the workforce started migrating from the cities to their hometowns, and
Yes.
So that was a major issue, and I believe that was a good move. Although a big relief package was announced in India also, but those packages were more industry focused and the sector focused, production linked incentives, and those kind of schemes were there, but we are not able to see a major impact. But here, what we saw was really good in terms of giving money directly in the hand of the industries or the corporates, so that they can retain the jobs, they can retain those employees. So I believe that was a good move. Starting with the questions, I believe before I take up the questions from my colleagues and the students, I have one question here, which I would like to start with. That pre-COVID, there was a big move towards what we call as gig economy or part-time work, and a lot of organizations and industries were also very comfortable having this part-time workforce. So what impact you see now COVID-19 has to that? Because we have seen a lot of disruptions, and in wake of industrial relations or labor law norms, what impact it will have on those gig workers or those part-time workers? Will that trend continue, or people would now start thinking in terms of having a full-time employment, because you never know, a situation like COVID may come again, and then you are really in trouble if you are a gig worker or a part-time worker?
Well, I guess if we look at that slide, that was, who was the hardest hit by COVID-19 were those vulnerable workers, those workers in precarious employment. Yes, the gig economy, that's what I was describing by those, what would we say, what was the language that was used, like their own business, but they're not, they're the price takers. They're not entrepreneurs. It's just another form. So look, that's been one of the difficulties is coming out of this. And you see the government congratulating itself because there's now more jobs in Australia than before COVID-19. However, 60% of the new jobs that were created post-COVID-19 were all casual. So there is a problem, and that, if we had a problem with precarious employment and low wage growth before COVID-19, that's just going to be exacerbated, and that's that leads to the issues of social cohesion, the inequality, which I guess you could say, maybe there's still a degree of equality in Australia, but it's not what we're used to. I guess that's probably that's going to be, an ongoing difficulty. Look, there's Varun has asked the question here that I might segue into, is what are the legal implications on the employment relationship? I think there's going to be a far greater emphasis on work health and safety. So workplace health and safety is now, it always was important in certain industries. So, building and construction, it was a very important aspect of the working environment or employment relationship. It is now becoming increasingly so in a range of industries where it's never been an issue before. So, like, first of all, does an employer have the right to require an employee to be vaccinated? That's a very interesting question at law. And, it's one that some workers are asking, whilst other workers are saying, where's my vaccine? So, you can't please all of the people, but that's one of the major changes is going to be in terms of, probably a greater emphasis. Can I say the hygiene has improved dramatically as a result of this. I had an Indian GP who used to say that how foolish Westerners were for shaking hands, because like if you shake hands, that's spreading germs, where it's much easier to greet in other ways. So a lot of changes now, like when you're introduced to someone, you just look at them now. So that's probably moved away from where we're trying to answer some of these questions. Now, the 4-day week, 46 hours, is that 46 hours in 4 days? So that's a pretty long working week for 4 days, I would have thought. That's what is it currently, I guess? I'd have to ask, the question, if it's a 4-day week with 46 hours, what is it currently?
We have a typically 40-hour work week.
40, yeah, okay. Yeah, which is where ours is 38 is the standard. Lots of people, most people work more than, well, you get both ends of the scale. A lot of people work more than 40 hours per week. Yeah, I'm not sure that would be a forward step. And I would be thinking that I'd be surprised if it's any different in India, but in Australia, women are still the primary caregivers in most instances. I would think it difficult to maintain that traditional role and work 46 hours. And I say that rightly or wrongly, they're still the traditional caregivers. I would think 46 hours is probably a retrograde step. Micro smallers are very vulnerable in terms of financial. Well, the micro and small enterprises, this is always a difficult question as to to what extent that small business will operate anyway, and whether or not what we talk about here or what policy government introduces, they have a tendency to just operate in their own way anyway. I think what I was talking about earlier is the difficulty in Australia is that aggregate demand stuff, is that that consumers aren't confident enough to be spending money, and that is the way in which small business will thrive here. I'm not sure whether that's the same in India, but that's a difficulty with our current system, and it's a difficulty with with that wealth inequality that is starting to creep into Australia. Two sides of the same coin. Yeah, okay. Well, there's, I guess, I'm not sure that employers and employees are necessarily the two sides of the same coin. I come from a school of thought that there's an inherent conflict in the employment relationship. The trick is, how do we manage that? And from that perspective, it would be reasonable to say that in Australia, we've probably seen things go to too far in one direction, and that is in the favour of employers to the detriment of employees, which each individual firm is doing that for their own competitive advantage, but how does that impact at a macro level? Working from home, yes, that's been a fascinating, and look what we're doing. Look, this is my study at home. I've got to say, I didn't want to leave home and come back to work. I enjoyed the lockdown. Had two boys at school last year as well. One of them's off to university this year, and can I say they thrived studying from home. So that this is, I guess, I've decided not to do any study on working from home because every other academic in employment relations is doing a study on working from home, and I guess I'll read what they say. But it's got a range of implications. It's got implication for workplace health and safety, particularly insofar as mental health is concerned. Now, I was one of the lucky ones. I was one of the ones who enjoyed working from home, and that I'm by no means an introvert, but there were some people who did not adjust well, whether that was the absence of human contact that did impact on a range of people in terms of their mental health, and some very, very sad stories of people not coping with that change or coping with going back to work. So you've had, again, it's a bit like the vaccination, had the range of people saying, you can't send me home, I want to come to work. And then you had people at the other end of the scale like me saying, I don't want to go back to work. I was quite happy. Aside from anything else, that's an hour commute that I didn't have to deal with. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I had half an hour to and from work, which would be on the lower scale for commuting. Then you go to a city like Sydney, and not unusual for people to have 2 hours either way. So that's 4 hours of your life every day in commuting. What a dreadful waste. So the use of artificial intelligence, I don't know, but in terms of technology, look at what we're doing now. This is, and in fact, what I found for teaching was absolutely fantastic for this reason. For what we're doing now, I in fact found that, I don't know whether the students did, that would be, I guess, a matter of opinion, that the capacity of a student to ask a question in this format, to write it down without interrupting the speaker, is a tremendous innovation. So from the academic side, I found it particularly good. However, that's okay for lectures. For tutorials, it is absolutely hopeless. it just does, that's my opinion, just does not work the same for a tutorial's meant to be a discussion, not you sit and listen to me. And from that perspective, it just doesn't work as well. Like I guess there's what's going to happen. Well, there was a case of someone working out, this was well before COVID, where someone was working from home and tripped over in their, going from their lounge room to their office, and then sued their employer for not providing a safe system of work. So, like I guess that's probably an absurd example. And even before COVID-19, there were, particularly in a place like Sydney, there was some employers, large insurance company sent its entire workforce home because, obviously, if you're dealing with a call center, you can tell whether people are working, whether you're there or not, or whether they're in front of you or not. So there was and think of the money they'd be saving in rent and electricity, which I guess is another issue. Have they just transferred that cost to the worker? But from my perspective, I'd happily bear that cost of whatever the additional electricity is in order to save an hour of my time every day commuting. I'm not sure, that was more a personal reflection to Varun than a considered response. But I think that's one of the key areas that we've found. Okay.
I think very interesting discussion, and I believe it's a long debate when we talk about the work from home or the impact of COVID on the modern workforce, the work hours, the perks and the benefits that people should get in lieu of saving a lot of costs for the organization. I believe we need to go back to the drawing board now, and we need to rewrite what we call in terms of the labor code or the norm or the regulations, because everything that happened has been unprecedented. And, as we say that there's a Murphy's Law that if things can go wrong, things will go wrong. So there is a new Murphy's Law now. If things can be done digitally, will be done digitally. So now every organization is thinking that, can we move permanently to a permanent work from home model? For example, a lot of IT companies in India, they did that. So Infosys, TCS, the major IT companies, they announced work from home in the beginning itself, and they have extended it till July or August permanently now. So yes, there is a lot of innovation happening in terms of labor laws, or a lot of work is required to be done in terms of IR also, given this new normal because of the pandemic that we have seen.
Yes. And for IT, why would you need to be? Like it's the classic example of there not being a need to have your workforce located in one spot, because by definition they can do their work remotely.
Yeah. And probably that will have implications in terms of remote monitoring or electronic performance management systems to be developed. To what can do that.
I think, as I said, the technology already exists to determine whether people are doing their jobs anyway. I guess if I'd always thought if a supervisor's got to stand over someone's shoulder to make sure they're working how effective is that, the employment of that supervisor? Like it's, I guess there's probably an entire level of management that can be done away with if you do it properly. If you're able to do this, and of course there's a degree of trust there too, isn't there? In being willing to trust your workforce that they're not going to goof off all day, and I guess if you've got proper performance targets, that shouldn't be a problem.
So I think the discussion is endless. We can go on and on, but due to paucity of time, I will not pull you back any further. Professor John Martin, I understand you're not a professor, but you are a doctor. You are a PhD, and the discussion and deliberations have been really interesting, and you have professed the theory of IR and employee relations in a very well articulated manner. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
the interesting discussion, a very insightful presentation that you have made. On behalf of Amity University Rajasthan family, we thank you, and we also invite you to visit our institution, our campus, whenever the situation normalizes, and we'll be very happy to have you with us once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for this opportunity. I've very much enjoyed it.
And I must appreciate Professor Shikha Sharma, our Director for International Relations, for coordinating with you for this session. She is working really hard to improve our industrial international relations and our collaborations, and we'll be very happy if we can get your support also to collaborate with some of the institutions in Australia or anywhere else we have where you have some contact. So my appreciation and my good wishes to Dr. Shikha also.
Thank you, sir.
For taking it forward.
Yeah, thank you, Shikha.
And yeah, sir, we look forward for a long-term association, what Pro Vice Chancellor sir has said. And we are really thankful to you, heartfelt gratitude to you. Means the presentation, the contents were really mesmerizing, and the number of questions which are there, but due to paucity of time, we cannot take all the questions. And thank you once again. Thank you, sir, Amit sir. And we'll connect in future too, and we can see what collaborations we can work upon in future. Thank you.
I look forward to it. Okay, I'll keep in contact.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.